Hello friends, welcome to the MARE Podcast. Before we get started, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Don't forget that you can find more about the MARE project at www.marehamburg.com, and you can support the project and this podcast through Patreon. All the links are in the description. Enjoy!
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the MARE Podcast. It is my pleasure to welcome Ella to the podcast tonight, or today, depending on where you're from. Ella is connected with us in this virtual studio all the way from Texas. So hello Ella, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me on. It's exciting to be here.
Of course. So Ella is doing a PhD at Texas AMU at the moment. And do you want to talk to us a bit about yourself and where you started before I should
absolutely.
introduce you? You can do
Yes.
it.
So I started out almost 10 years ago. I went up to Oxford to study archaeology and anthropology. About a year and a half in, I took a sort of leave of absence for several years. And during that time, I was back home in Canada, where I'm from the West Coast originally. And when I was there, I was working on passenger ferries. And in particular, I really enjoyed working as a deckhand, which meant I was doing a lot of ship husbandry. I was working on the bridge, standing lookout, all the rest of those things. And when I came back to Oxford in January of 2020, which was fantastic timing, I realized that I really wanted to do maritime archaeology. It was an option. I decided, let's try this out. Let's see how it goes. I think I got about 2 lectures in and I was like, okay, this is it. This is it, 100%. I've grown up around ships all my life. When I was 14 years of age with my school, we actually spent about a week on a tall ship. I've just always been around the water. I've always loved it. And so it's kind of one of those things you look back on and you realize it's sort of inevitable that you ended up where you are. But when I was at Oxford, during my undergraduate sort of last year and a half, I started really to think about landscape and ships and how those two things interact. And as a result, I ended up writing my undergraduate dissertation on the West Coast Trail, where I'm from Vancouver Island, which is the largest island off the west coast of North America. And on the west coast of that island, we have a life-saving trail that was built in the early 1900s after a shipwreck there claimed the lives of over 120 people. The entire region there is known as the Graveyard of the Pacific, from the mouth of the Columbia River in Oregon in the United States to the north end of Vancouver Island. There's an estimated 2,000 shipwrecks in that region. A lot of those are clustered around the mouth of the Columbia because the Columbia doesn't really have a delta. It just empties out into the ocean. But a lot of them are also on the west coast of Vancouver Island because it sits about 45 degrees at an angle of 45 degrees off the coast, and ships traveling north from the United States, if they were trying to go to Seattle or Vancouver, which they would have to go through the Juan de Fuca Strait, which is just the southern end of Vancouver Island, if they missed that, they would end up on the rocks. And so I was specifically looking, the area of the West Coast Trail is now a national park and reserve in Canada. And that region alone has about 200 known shipwrecks. So it's filled with old decaying remains of boats. And even if you walk the West Coast Trail today, which many people do, it's now a recreational trail. You will find there's just boilers, bits of ships just scattered across the beaches. So it's a really fantastic place. And I realized that not much archaeology had been done about it. I ended up working with Parks Canada. They were very, very generous with me, gave me fantastic resources, including some of their unpublished material. But it was really exciting because it was, the first time I felt like I was able to look at this through the eyes of archaeology rather than just, the standard sensational history books we tend to get. So that was my undergraduate. And then for my master's, I returned to Oxford. I was still interested in boats, figured that was what I liked to do. And it actually took me quite a while to work out what I wanted to do with my master's. For a while, I was thinking about canoes on the West Coast, because Vancouver Island alone, we've got 3 major cultural Indigenous groups, and each has their own specific style of canoe, which is perfectly adapted to that region. So for instance, on the West Coast, around the area of the West Coast Trail, you will find the canoes have a very specific design that allows them to be launched into the Pacific Ocean, which has very high waves. This, of course, differs from what you find on the East Coast. But after a while, I realized that wasn't quite what I wanted to do. And so I considered my own heritage. And so my past, my heritage is Métis. We are one of the 3 Indigenous peoples of Canada. My ancestors were fur traders and Indigenous women. They married, they had children. Those children developed a community, a language, a culture of their own. So we are the Métis people. Our sort of ancestral homeland is around Manitoba, which is the center of Canada. And so in Manitoba, of course, this was the heart of the Canadian fur trade. So fur trade in Canada began very early on the East Coast, some of the early contact there. But it wasn't really until the sort of 17th, especially into the 18th century, that we really see the proper growth of the fur trade. And this is because in 1670 or thereabouts, we get the establishment of the Hudson Bay Company. Now, you also have the French in Canada as well, and French fur traders and British fur traders operated very differently. The French fur traders, they were largely their own free agents. They would go out, they would make contact with communities. A lot of them married into communities. They would trade for furs, they'd bring it back. But the British, of course, did things differently. They operated along similar lines as the East India Company in terms of having these company forts. And so these were built along the coast of Hudson Bay, which is, of course, the big bay in Canada. These are called factories. And their mode of operation was that they would have local Indigenous people, hunters, come to them. And so for a long time, this is how they worked. One of the big forts was Fort York. You can still visit it today, although it's quite tricky to get to. These would be connected to each other via, the trade company would be using small schooners, things like that, or small vessels, rather, I should say, to connect to each other. Inland, though, as I said, this was mostly done by Indigenous people who were then bringing it to the fur traders on the coast. From there, that would all be shipped to London. However, after the British gained control of Canada in the 1750s, we see a shift in fur trade. This is also driven by increasing demand for furs as well as decreasing availability of furs and pelts. For instance, by the 1790s, around James Bay, which is a small bay off the Hudson Bay. I say small, you have to understand, this is Canada small. It's quite big. But in the area of James Bay, for instance, by the 1790s, we had an extirpation of swans and other feathered birds because they'd all been captured, they'd all been killed, they'd all been taken away. So we are seeing an increasing drive towards the west as fur traders are trying to get more and more furs. This is also, of course, exacerbated by any types of, diseases within the animals, things like that, climatic changes. It's not a great situation. So we see a change in the British style. They're starting to move inland. They're no longer confining themselves to the forts. And by the 1820s, we see the Hudson Bay Company. This is the company that was established in 1670. They have a monopoly. They have managed to beat out all the other fur traders. They have gained complete control over this place called Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land, about 40% of modern Canada, larger than modern India. This is a huge area of land. They have control. They are the ones who are essentially the government there. Of course, you do have Indigenous communities, but these communities throughout the centuries have been affected severely by disease and other things. So that is the basis of my research for my master's. I was looking at what the role of waterways was in the rise of the Métis culture. I looked at that through the lens of the different vessels and vehicles they used. So for instance, we've got our standard birch bark canoe. Of course, you also have the York boat. This is the boat that becomes so important for the trade of the Hudson Bay Company. I argue as well, slightly controversially, that we should consider the classic Red River cart a form of maritime transport, technically speaking. So these Red River carts, they're very simple carts. They were built by the Métis. They could travel very long distances, unlike your stereotypical pioneer wagons, the Conestoga wagons we've all seen pictures of with the canvas hoods and all the rest of them. Those things were absolutely terrible. They had a lot of iron components. Those would break. If that broke, if you didn't have a forge at hand, which most people didn't, you couldn't repair it. Red River carts, on the other hand, were made entirely of wood and entirely of animal sinew and other material. And so as a result, they could be repaired fairly quickly. They made an absolute horrible noise when they were traveling because they had no grease on their axles. It's said that you could hear them coming from miles away. But the best advantage of them is in Canada, in America, there's a lot of rivers. And of course, you can't, you don't have bridges, then you need to be able to transport these carts across. So all they'd have to do, there's 2 wheels. They'd remove the wheels, strap them underneath. They'd get big stitched buffalo hide or bison hide. They'd put that over top, tie it all tight, and it would be a raft.
Wow.
And you could swim across with it and then reassemble it and get back on the buffalo hunt, which is usually what they were used for. So that was my master's thesis, essentially.
It was a hybrid
far too
vehicle.
theoretical. Sorry, it was a hybrid, yeah.
It was a hybrid vehicle. So why do you think it's controversial to say that it's a maritime vehicle?
You look at it and you don't really, your first thought is not, this could technically be a boat or a raft.
But it could.
It could. I mean, it wasn't great and you didn't want to use it for long term, but it was the best way to get things across rivers.
Yeah. So if it worked, then it worked. It didn't need anything more than that.
I mean, they were extremely practical, not very comfortable, not really, but they worked. And they worked better than most other types of vehicles.
Oh, wow.
I mean, this is the thing, of course, within North America and the Americas, the wheel existed, but most terrain isn't suited for wheeled transportation. So a lot of concessions really have to be made when until of course nowadays when we have cars everywhere. So that is basically where I'm up to now. And my research now as my PhD, I am looking into those boats, those York boats. I'm looking into that transition between the use of birch bark canoes and then in the early 19th century, the introduction of these York boats. My specific area of focus is the Hayes River, and this is the river that ran from Lake Manitoba. Lake Manitoba is Lake Winnipeg, I should say. Please correct me. Lake Winnipeg is the 12th, I believe, largest lake in the world. It's huge. It's very shallow. And from Winnipeg, Lake Winnipeg, up to the mouth of the Hudson River, you've got the Hayes River, and it's about 600 kilometers or so. And all along that, this was the route that the York boats would travel, bringing the furs to the York factory. From there, they would be shipped all the way to London and sold in one single auction house.
Oh, wow.
And so my hope is to look at that, looking specifically at portage sites. And this is because these rivers, fantastic when they are, in good condition, but a lot of places you'll have rapids, you'll have difficult conditions. You can't take a boat through that. So you'll need to go around. And so some of these portage sites, I've seen references, and this is the frustrating part of my research. I will see statements such as, this portage site has been used for thousands of years. And me as an archaeologist said, okay, well, can I see some archaeology about that? And I have difficulty finding it. But these sites were used over and over again because, of course, they'd be. It's the most sensible path. So I'd actually really love to go in and have a look at some of these portage sites because people wouldn't just pass through in a day; they'd stay overnight. I found references to certain sites where they have things like pipe stems, other material objects that have been left behind by fur traders. So ideally, I'd like to go and look at that.
Oh yeah, that was my initial question was like, how do you research that? So is obviously not a library
with difficulty. Well, it is and it isn't. I can actually do a lot of archival research as well because obviously being a company, Hudson Bay Company kept fairly meticulous records. And in particular, what I would like to revisit, I've looked at it briefly during my master's, but I would like to go back and look at some of the journals of officers traveling on these brigades of boats, whether it was canoe or York boats, because they'd often, in true 18th century British fashion, they would be meticulous about recording latitude and sometimes eventually later longitude as well. So it's that kind of information is very useful because then you can see, does it actually align with the river? Can we see where they're stopping off? Can we measure distance, how far they're traveling in a day, etc.? So there is some data. Now, the difficulty, of course, is the archaeological material. Obviously, being a boreal forest in a lot of places, there isn't necessarily the best preservation conditions. There is, as I am only aware of one historical York boat that is still in existence. It's at Lower Fort Garry Park, or National Park in Manitoba. It was built in the 1920s. They were still building these things up until the 1920s, 1930s. The rest of them, I've seen very elusive references to comments being made about them being in swamps. If I could find out which swamps, that would be very useful. But that is the difficulty. And these things, they were meant to last about 3 years. Birch bark canoes are even more difficult to find in the archaeological record. They tended to have a lifespan of just a year, as used by fur traders. Within indigenous communities, that's a different story. That being said, birch bark canoes, there are extant examples in museums. So for instance, the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, I believe, has one that dates to the 18th century. And it's been identified, I believe, as coming from around Quebec. But that kind of thing would probably, I may end up looking into as well to sort of, see what's out there, the availability. But in terms of material goods that exist, there are trade goods, and that is the one thing that would be very exciting to find. Things like axe heads, beads, all of these different components that were brought over from overseas. Cloth was a huge thing as well. We obviously wouldn't expect that to survive. But there's been, in the 1960s, there was some really interesting work done in, I believe, Minnesota, but I may be incorrect, in that region of the United States. And they actually looked underwater and found archaeological assemblages of accident sites. So things like axe heads, as I said, all these things they'd find on the bottom of rivers.
Yeah.
Of course, it's very difficult to do. That kind of dive work is not easy. You're working in strong currents and dangerous conditions. You have to be very careful. I'm not sure that I'm the primary investigator for that kind of thing, but it does exist. So it's out there somewhere. My challenge is, of course, just trying to find that.
That's super. So first of all, a clarification question, because that's the first time I'm hearing most of these terms. So is it a York boat, as in,
yes.
like we say,
so
York,
as in
the
city
area
of York.
in the UK? Oh, the city of York. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a York boat. Okay.
Yeah. So the York boat, named for York Factory, I should say, which is this fur trade fort on the Hudson Bay. And there's also a modern community called York Factory.
Okay. So this sounds like a very, I don't want to say niche topic, but a very, very specific topic.
It is a very specific topic.
And I was wondering, do you know anybody else who's working on this stuff? Or is it just you against the world?
There's a few others a few other archaeologists that are working on fur trade material. So I apologize because I don't know how to pronounce the surname, but I think it's Cipolla. Cipolla, and Allard. They've produced some really interesting things in the last few years. However, and if there's someone out there who does this and would like to contact me and I could pick their brain over it, within Canada at least, I am not aware of many people doing this. Which is a shame, because it's such a fascinating part of history. It's important. The rivers in North America, I very strongly, my kind of controversial hot take, I'll talk about this at the pub kind of thing, is that we need to start looking at the rivers in North America the way we see the Mediterranean in terms of its ability to connect.
All right.
Throughout history.
Because I'm a bit, judging from where I'm from, I don't know how many rivers are in Canada or how they were used. So,
well, okay. According to the WWF, according to Canadian Geographic, there are more than 8,500 named rivers in Canada. Overall watershed area, that kind of information I don't have to hand. But there are a lot.
There are a lot of rivers in Canada. So how did you envision this? How did people use the rivers in Canada? Because you said you compared it to the Mediterranean, so
in terms
that's a high bar to reach, I think.
Yeah, well, it's slight hyperbole, but I mean, one of my favorite examples is, so in the modern city of Winnipeg, they were doing excavations about 20 some odd years ago, and there's this site called the Forks, which is where two major rivers, the Assiniboine and the Red River, converge. And this site has thousands of years of history of archaeological material. One of the most exciting things they found was a conch shell that came up from the Gulf of Mexico, or Gulf of America, I suppose I should be saying now.
Oh my God! Wait, what is that? What is that? Say it again. What did they find? What did they find?
A conch shell. But yeah, I mean, going back to my point, this is sort of irrelevant, but you find materials that have come from great distances in, Manitoba, which is in kind of, it feels very far north. It's actually more kind of like the middle of North America. But you do find all these things there that came up from the rivers. And of course, this is what built the backbone of the fur trade. These were not, I think the classic way of looking at the fur trade is, bold voyageurs, these fur traders, as they're called, the French voyageurs, going out and, carving new paths and finding these isolated communities. That's not really how it was. The reality is these were already established routes. These were established networks. French fur traders in particular, the reason they would marry into indigenous communities was because their wives would have family members, and it would just be joining a network, a kinship network. So these were not new paths being blazed. These were already in existence. Of course, the difficulty is trying to look at pre-contact riverine trade can be tricky because, of course, a lot of things that would have been traded were things that don't necessarily show up well in the archaeological record. But we do have evidence pointing to fairly long distance. Now, of course, then we get into the question of how frequent is it? Is this a one-off? Is this, someone's epic journey that they've now brought back, this rare, valuable object? That's not my field. I'm sure I hope there's someone studying this. Yeah. But there is contact. And this is the thing, this is coming back to the fur trade, and this is where it gets, in my opinion, quite interesting, especially within the Métis culture and the Métis people. You would have these networks of kinship that would span thousands of miles. You would have your family, and you would know that you've got family way, way, way up in the Northwest Territories, what's now the Northwest Territories in the far north. You would have family in Winnipeg, what's now Winnipeg. You would have family elsewhere. It would be this entire network, and it was mostly through the rivers. And wow. This is still something that's important. It's still strongly considered. And interestingly, within Métis philosophy and worldview, there is this idea of the land, and the land is something that not just is sort of terrestrial, but encompasses rivers as well. So there's less of a distinct separation.
Wow. So how you mentioned it, but is this how rivers are treated today in Canada? How are they used today, or are they just like
quite badly? Quite badly.
Okay.
I mean, so this is. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to go to do this, because at the time I was fresh out of high school and I was working full time. But my mother and my stepfather, actually, they're crazy. They took a sailboat, about a 12-foot sailboat, from near the glaciers in the Rocky Mountains, almost all the way to Winnipeg across the prairies.
Oh, wow.
So the idea was they'd sail. My stepfather ended up rowing most of it. But it was really interesting for them. And I think that may have also influenced why I ended up doing this, because of their stories. Because this was the first boat that had traveled like that since the York boats.
True. Okay.
So it was really, but I mean, the condition of the rivers in Canada, a huge issue is, for instance, water sovereignty is a huge issue. Most Indigenous communities in Canada are located along rivers and lakes, I think, watershed or waterways, but they don't have control. And so they don't have control over so for instance, typing. So for instance, in 2016, the largely Indigenous city of Prince Albert in Saskatchewan was forced to temporarily pump water from alternative sources after the North Saskatchewan River was contaminated by a pipeline leak.
Oh my God.
So that's a huge issue. We have environmental impact of pipelines and other things like that. There are, especially because the way in Canada we have our reservations where a lot of Indigenous people live, although of course not all of them do. But a huge issue is you will get water contamination. So Grassy Narrows in particular, I think is still suffering from long-term poisoning effects of the water. There are reservations where people cannot bathe in the water because it's contaminated. So it's, in Canada, we like to think of ourselves as, being very focused on nature, having, wonderful natural resources. The reality is a lot more complicated, and the reality is we don't treat it as well as we should. We could get into a whole side discussion over water sovereignty, over hydroelectric and the impact on indigenous communities. That's a whole other conversation for another thing. That's not my focus, but it is.
Okay, yeah, sure.
It is things I end up touching on because you can't, it's unavoidable. Now, that being said, for my research, the Hayes River is quite unique in that it's not been touched by hydroelectric. So it is relatively unaltered from what it was before.
Yeah, it makes sense. But at the same time, yeah, you say that basically the water bodies in Canada are suffering from various causes, but at the same time, you talk about how important they are in the study of heritage, basically, of Canada. But this is something that you say here. Are there any other advocates of this approach to, like, rivers are part of our heritage and we should protect them? Or is it something that you, in an ideal world, would want to do in the future, kind of like be an advocate of that?
I mean, there's a lot of people who are fighting for water rights and for protection of waterways, especially within Indigenous communities. There are a lot of active voices out there who are doing that kind of work. I'm piggybacking along. I'm not, nothing I'm saying is new or unique. It's all been said before. As I said, in particular, the issue of clean drinking water is still a huge issue, and there are a lot of people fighting for that right.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think you're doing a very important work of kind of legitimizing how this is important. And this is not, I mean, I'm talking about it like it's a small thing, but this is not just about clean water, about drinking water. Like, obviously that's super big, but it's also, it has layers to it, it has levels to it. And I think it's a very, 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 very interesting way of seeing things. And I'm trying to think of any other, if I can think of any other examples of waterways being treated like that, and I can't think of any. I don't know if there are any other comparisons, if you know, throughout the world.
Yeah, this is stuff I should look into more.
Okay, sorry, I'm pushing it, but you seem
no, it's fine.
Into it, and I was like, let's push it, let's see how far we can go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking here at my notes. I mean, sort of, the statistic is 90% of Indigenous communities in Canada live by water bodies, but the majority are administered by the federal government.
Okay.
Which means that they have little control over it. And that, I think, that to me is, if there's one thing I can do with my work, emphasizing the connection with waterways, the importance of waterways, and the fact that they are not something that can be separated from terrestrial heritage. It's all one and the same. And that's, I grew up next to the coast, so I think that might be why, I don't see, there isn't a distinction between, there's not as much of a distinction between land and water as we like to think there is. And that has been explored in great detail by other scholars, in particular Ben Ford. His book, The Shore is a Bridge, which talks about the Great Lakes, is particularly interesting, particularly informative for me. I've relied on that throughout many theses now. But it's something that it is definitely in the background of my research, because that is always a question I'm asking myself is, we as archaeologists, we love our work. We think it's endlessly fascinating, but it can be difficult to communicate the value of that to other people. It's very easy to just look, okay, well, we're looking at old boats. Okay. Who cares? What does it really matter? We know it matters to us.
Of course.
And we understand the social impact, but.
So how do you communicate this, your research, your conclusions, your results, your thoughts? How do you communicate them to the public if you were to tell someone else and not like yourself, or if you want to tell yourself? So how do you envision yourself doing it?
I mean, I think going forward, out of my PhD, what I'd really like to do is just be able to, I have a feeling I'll probably have to write a book. And, just communicating through that, just this sort of overlooked aspect of the past that, up till now has often been viewed through, only really looked at into detail by people who are just, very interested in the subject, but not towards a broad audience. And that's, of course, that's the challenge. I mean, that is generally the issue is I'm always wondering to myself how to better communicate, how to involve other people in my research, make what I'm doing more clear, because it's, as I said, it can be very easy to just think, well, I know all about it, it matters to me, but how do you communicate that? And I think my unfortunate feeling is I probably have to get better at social media.
So this is very important, right? Because I also think that the natural thought process of an archaeologist is that I study something, I think it's important, I should communicate it. How do I do it? I write a book. But of course, the problem with books is that they need to be read, right?
And you also need to make sure that you are writing something that's actually readable and engaging.
Yeah,
because
you don't only have to convince your readers. Before that, you have to convince publishing house that this is
and
very
of course
important.
there's the different types as well. Of course you can have your much more standard academic book that will be read by specialists in the field, or you can try and make something a bit more popular. But of course there's challenges with that, because you often have to simplify. You have to be very careful how you go about that, so you're not just making it a very nice easy story and ignoring a lot of the nuance because you think that people won't get it.
Yes, true. But you also said that I should get better at social media. And I think a big problem with that is that, for example, a lot of archaeology is being communicated, for example, through social media, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through small videos like quick reels or TikTok videos or stuff like that, which are maximum 10 seconds long, 20
and
seconds long.
Yeah, trying to communicate.
Yeah, how do you fit a whole book in 20 seconds? You just say a catchphrase, right? And you just move on. So on one thing, it's important to communicate it and get people interested in it by kind of clickbaiting them into, did you know this and this and this and this? But at the same time, if they're not interested enough to research it further, they just stuck with an information in their heads that they lack context of.
You need to be very careful how you do it.
So it's
a challenge.
I see what you're saying. Like, oh yeah, we need to get on social media, and I agree.
Yeah,
I completely agree, and I love when people use social media to do that. And there's so many pages dedicated to archaeology throughout the world. But at the same time, I see what they're like doing. For example, writing a title, like a nice catchy title, a nice picture.
Yeah.
And then there's a link that you need to read 13 pages to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And I doubt that people will do it.
No, they won't.
So how do you communicate archaeology? It's a very difficult trick.
It is a difficult one. I don't at the moment have any concrete answers in terms of.
I mean, yeah.
What best to do.
I mean, I don't know.
Podcasts are good.
I found the podcast is really good, actually. Not like this podcast, no self-glazing here, but like podcast overall. And I think there is a rise in historical archaeology.
Well, I mean, I know. Podcasts. I think the rest is history. I think sold out the Albert Hall.
Yeah. I mean, the rest is history has like, I think it's the biggest, maybe bigger podcast about history. Yeah. And it's so good, right? It's so interesting.
Yeah, it's informative. It's digestible.
Yeah,
but fun. It's also it's accessible. That's the thing.
True.
And that to me is, I mean, that's my. I mean, I've kind of I'm repeating myself here, but I think that's my big concern is just. It's one thing to know it yourself, but to help other people understand it. That's the trouble.
Yeah.
And to that's first of all, that is a skill, but it's also something I think that's a bit innate. I don't know if I have that.
Yeah, there's this important conversation that it needs to be had in archaeology about.
Yeah.
So what are the skills that an archaeologist need to have?
Yeah, I don't want my work to just be a thesis on a bookshelf. I don't want that to be the grand sum of my work.
Exactly. So I think, for example, what comes to my head now is if we move past podcast and we go to YouTube, I've been watching, I don't know if you have seen Oversimplified.
Okay.
Say an amazing guy doing wonderful kind of animated videos, which are informative and interesting and funny. But at the same time, they're very well researched.
Yeah. Long form YouTube can be good, but it requires.
Yeah. It requires a lot of work, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that guy posts a video once a year
Yeah.
because he actually needs to do the work. But we live in a world that moves so fast that at the same time, a slower pace, take your time, work through it. I don't know. It pays off if it's extremely good, but if
Yeah.
it's not, it doesn't. I don't know. Maybe that's just how I feel.
No, I agree. I mean, it's sort of, I think you need to find that balance between kind of the full length feature film kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then the off the cuff every week, this is what's going on. There needs, I think more, to my mind at least, I think the attitude of more limited series where you get people's attention and then have a set number and you stick to that, that might work a bit better. But it's tricky. It's definitely tricky.
I see. Anyway, let's go back to you for a bit. Yeah, and we can come back to conversations like that in the future. So,
well, more I don't have any answers. That's the thing. I'm trying to figure out myself.
I mean, I don't have the answers either. I'm just posing questions, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important to pose those questions because me and you may not have the answer, but someone might be listening who has the answer, or just thought.
Let me know.
Or maybe someone with a talented content creator or graphics designer or something like that. I was like, maybe I should do this. Maybe I should talk to archaeologists and do this thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, you are now. I want to ask you about. You are now in Texas.
Yes.
Right, Texas A&M, and before you were doing your bachelor's and your master's in Oxford, and you're Canadian working working for the archaeology of Canada, basically.
Yeah.
So, why Texas? Why did you move away? Why did you come to Oxford in the first place, and why did you move out of Oxford?
Well, I went to Oxford in the first place because I was an overconfident 17-year-old who realized I all my life up to that point I wanted to do medicine. And then I realized that I didn't want to do that anymore. I briefly flirted with the idea of art school, then I realized I wasn't good enough at art. And then I all my life I've loved archaeology ever since I was a child. I grew up partly in Scotland. Every weekend I'd drive my parents around to castles and make them look at things. So it was kind of inevitable that I liked archaeology. And so I decided I'm going to study archaeology. I applied to a bunch of universities in Canada. In my final year of high school, I had a grade that was not really good, so I ended up getting about 4 rejections, and that annoyed me. And so I decided I'm going to do archaeology. I'm going to find out what the best university in the world for that is. So I Googled it, and it was Oxford. That's what came up. I'm like, okay, let's apply. I'm not going to get in. And then I got in. And then I had to panic. And it was partly influenced. I lived in the UK growing up, off and on, so the UK felt like home to me. It wasn't this strange new adventure in this faraway place. It was quite familiar, quite comfortable. So that's why I came for my undergraduate degree, and then for my master's as well. I just liked it. I liked working with my supervisor, Dr. Damien Robinson. I liked the people. I felt this is a good place to be, so I came back for my master's as well. It's also difficult in Canada. We don't have, as I am aware, I believe it's changing because I know last year there was a posting for a maritime archaeology professorship position, but we don't have any programs for maritime archaeology specifically. I believe there's a few graduate level courses or postgraduate level courses available, but in terms of an actual university with a maritime archaeology department, we don't have that. So I needed to look elsewhere. For my PhD, I applied to Oxford. And was accepted twice, but Texas A&M here, Texas A&M here was able to offer me significant funding, and in addition, there were people here who really knew more what I was researching. And then, the people at Oxford are fantastic, but the focus there tends to be more old world. And my research and trying to conduct North American research from the UK drove me up the wall a few times. There was one time in particular I remember I had to email, I think I emailed Harvard University to get a specific scan of a chapter because no other, I think that was about the closest geographical university that had a book I was looking for. when I was actually writing up my master's thesis, the best resource I ended up finding was actually my local public library in Vancouver, because they had a lot of books on it that I just couldn't get in the UK. So that was also the geographic motivation. We have a lot of people here at A&M who are studying or looking at modern North American shipbuilding. So, for instance, my professor, or my supervisor, I should say, Dr. Piotr Bojakowski, he recently wrapped up a project looking at a 19th century schooner or 19th century vessel that was just rotting away off the coast of Washington State. So he knows what I'm talking about when I start rambling. So that's partly why I came to Texas. It's been an adjustment. Texas. It's great. There's a lot here. It's never dull, that's for sure. But the university here, the people here have been really fantastic. The project, there's you can't be bored in this department. We're really lucky. We have the entire lower floor of a 3-floor building.
Nice.
So we take up an entire floor here, and it's
nice.
filled with all kinds of things, and yeah.
Wow. So I just realized that I've been calling the university Texas AMU for the past 40 minutes.
I mean, you're not
Texas
entirely
right.
It also goes by TAMU or like TAMU.
Yes, that's what I had in mind. Yeah, it's my fault. Texas A&M University, no Texas AMU. But
yeah,
I mean,
that's all right.
Anyway, yeah, you got it. I just realized that I've been saying it wrong the whole time. Anyway, you mentioned something very important, and I want to touch upon that, and that is funding in archaeology and funding in PhDs, and especially I think we need to talk about the UK-US situation with having to pay an enormous amount of money to study.
I mean, if I had studied, or if I had taken up the PhD offer at Oxford, I would have been paying, as an international student, at least £27,000 a year. And that is...
If not more.
If not more. That's not something I can afford. I paid for... The reason I took 6 years to do a 3-year undergraduate degree is because I spent 3 of those years working full-time, saving as much as I could. And even now, I mean, the rate that international students pay at Oxford, I believe, for archaeology and anthropology, when I started, it was about £21,000 a year. It is, I believe, 48 now.
Wow.
It has gone up exponentially. And there is also not a huge amount of funding.
No, there's no funding.
For some reason as well, Canada in particular, we are a bit of a black spot. There's very little funding for Canadians studying in the UK. For PhD in particular, I was crippled. I was crippled by the fact that I had studied as an undergraduate at Oxford. So I was exempt. I was not allowed to get any federal funding because I didn't have an undergraduate degree from a Canadian university.
Okay, I don't know what the basis of that is. I imagine
I don't know either.
Something behind.
Yeah, I was ineligible for federal scholarships because I hadn't studied a Canadian undergrad.
Oh my god. Okay,
so
okay then.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh wow. Yeah. So funding in archaeology, and as you said, I think right now when I applied, doing a DPhil in classical archaeology, I think costs for international students, I think was £36,000 per year.
Yeah.
So
and it increases every year as well.
And it increases every year. So if you apply for like a classical archaeology degree, you need to pay for the 3 years, like more than £100,000 in fees, and then I don't know how many £1,000 in living in.
Well, and Oxford's not cheap either.
It's not cheap, right? It's not the most expensive place in the world, but it's not cheap. So.
And that's the big difference with the US. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the US here
shaped by money, basically.
Yeah. Here in the US, all of the PhDs here have funding. They will not accept you unless you are funded. And so as a result, that meant that I was in a cohort of 3 people. But A&M also is very fortunate. They have very good funding. So this year coming up, I believe there's 7 incoming anthropology, archaeology PhDs.
Okay. So where does the funding come from? Is it federal funding, government funding? Because I think there was a severely cut, wasn't it?
Yeah, I know there's been some concerns over cuts to National Science Foundation, NSF grants, and other things like that. Hopefully we'll fly under the radar for a while. The university, though, itself is very well endowed. It has about, I think, almost twice the endowment of Oxford.
Oh, wow.
So it's
Wow.
and of course the difficulty with Oxford is you've got a fairly reasonable endowment, but it's split up against, amongst all the colleges and all the rest of it. You've got, all that, the 39 different colleges with varying levels of funding themselves. So that's an additional challenge.
That makes things even more complicated. You're right. Anyway, let's not get all gloomy and sad about money, because it is a very sad topic in archaeology. And I know. Sadly, I think I know way too many people who's like they had to shape their dreams in a way so they can like do them, because sometimes some dreams are not unreachable because you can't do it. It's because you don't have enough money to do it. Very elitist, disgustingly elitist. Anyway, let's move on. Let's move on to a different topic.
Something more cheerful.
Yeah, let's move to something more cheerful, please. So anyway, the first time I've heard about you was when you were at fieldwork.
Yes.
And I think you traveled quite a bit for fieldwork throughout your studies. Or did you not?
Not really.
Did, right?
Cyprus was the furthest place I've ever been.
That's pretty far, isn't it? I
don't know.
It's very far. Anyway, where?
I also went. I went to university actually more than 5,000 kilometers away from where I was born. So
true.
Long distances aren't too much of a big deal.
All right, so talk to us about fieldwork. Where did you work in the field so far?
So I actually have depressingly little field experience. I had a few weeks after my first year in undergraduate where I was working in Dorchester upon Thames on a Roman site. And then after that, when I came back and resumed my undergraduate degree, it was COVID. So that meant no field work for me. So
or anyone.
No,
that matter.
No, so it was my fieldwork experience is fairly limited. This summer, hopefully, fingers crossed, all will go ahead. I'll be doing some work in the Mediterranean, but we'll see. That's classic case of just waiting for permits and all the rest of it.
All right, yeah. Is it maritime stuff?
Yes, yeah, it's a Hellenistic wreck.
Ooh, even more interesting. Can you tell us more, or can you not?
I don't know how much. Like,
okay,
I think it's not a secret, but it's I.
Can you tell us the country?
Turkey.
Hellenistic shipwreck. Turkey.
It's near Bodrum. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Is
it the one that Ludwiger wrote an article about?
I don't think so. It was discovered back in like the 1970s. But basically half the site, I think, was buried under boulders, and so they left it alone for a very long time, and now they're returning to it. It's Serchio, but the Hellenistic shipwreck, not the famous glass shipwreck, which is all the million pieces of beautiful medieval glass.
I admire people who are working with like glass typology when there's like 11 million different types of glass vessels.
Well, especially the Serchio glass. I mean, this is going off on a tangent, but the Serchio glass shipwreck in particular is because these were already broken pieces being used as ballast that were going to be taken to, Constantinople and then recycled.
Yeah.
So already they're in bits. And now there are poor scholars who are sitting there piecing them back together bit by bit.
Oh, yeah.
The results are fantastic. Absolutely beautiful. I think it's one of the largest collections, if not the largest collection, of medieval glassware.
It's crazy. I get PTSD just by thinking about it. Like the people having to do that puzzle.
I think you need to be a Zen master.
Yeah, I can't even imagine it. I mean, I suppose what they do is like they separate them by colors, I imagine.
Yeah, it's
and
a
then by
jigsaw
thickness or something, and then just try to figure it out. I should get a glass specialist. I don't know any glass specialist. I should get a glass specialist in here. Anyway, to talk about glass, Yeah. So,
but yeah, that's going to be hopefully my fieldwork this summer is just getting more experience, especially underwater, as a maritime archaeologist. Even though I realize with my own research, it's almost probably going to be terrestrial.
Yeah, but at the same time, I don't think it's super important and super nice to do underwater stuff, right?
Yeah, and I
If
mean,
you
it's
can,
something I'm
why not?
interested in, and looking forward, I would love to, for instance, work with Parks Canada, our National Park Service. They have an underwater archaeology team.
They do. Yep.
That would be my absolute dream to work with them. But so this kind of experience is useful and it's interesting.
So what do they
good.
do in Parks Canada? I think they're doing the Arctic stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the Arctic right now. So obviously the most famous ones are the Franklin expedition shipwrecks, HMS Terror and Erebus, which are ongoing. There's a few others as well that are up there. And of course, with climate change, it's really important to start that work because things are changing very rapidly. We of course also have the Great Lakes, and that's a whole other kettle of fish, especially in terms of climate change, because you're seeing invasive species, which are of course degrade. Things like zebra mussels are massively degrading the wrecks that are there. So and I mean Canada, in terms of I feel like we're going down a slightly depressing rabbit hole, but Canada is one of the countries that is experiencing climate change the fastest. And it's very evident. I mean, for my own field work, something I'm concerned with is if I'm going to be going, if I'm going to be doing any field work in Manitoba, I'll need to be aware of the fire seasons because, every year now we're getting worse and worse wildfires, and that's a huge issue.
It is, I think, throughout the world nowadays.
Yeah.
Well, but if you say that Canada is affected more than any place, I imagine it's terrible. Even though sometimes fires, they bring up.
They can be useful for archaeology. Yes. Yeah. Well, the thing is, you'd want us to time it so you're going afterwards when everything's clear cut for you, basically.
This conversation has gone dark real quick.
I'm sorry.
Let's hope that there's no wildfires. But if they are, let's hope there is small and
time it right.
Yeah, time it right. Don't burn the whole country down.
Yeah.
Just a
I
bunch.
will say sometimes I do admit I do wish that I'd studied things that were a bit more ancient, because I feel like it's the trouble with my field is in my particular focus is I'm very aware of the long-term negative impact that a lot of this stuff has had. And it's a bit unpleasant, but someone needs to face it. So
yes, someone needs to face it.
I'm not going to shy away from it.
Yeah, if you were not doing what you're doing and you did something more ancient, what would you be doing?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I often just think to myself that it would just be nice to, have like this one Roman shipwreck or, one Hellenistic shipwreck that I'm interested in. And that's my thing. And that's what I look at. And, I never have to worry about anything else. All I'm worried about is whether or not it's Etruscan or whatnot. That kind of thing.
I think we're past that stage
in
the archaeology.
That's the trouble. That's the trouble. I want to be an archaeologist 100 years ago. Just let me do my thing. There's no regulations, no rules. I sit around. We'll make everyone else do the work.
And I wear a suit.
The colonial dream,
Oh my god, yeah! I'll wear a suit to the trench and like take pictures with finds, like looking, staring at them.
Look at this thing I dug up myself.
Oh my god, it's and everything you write is innovative, right?
Yeah.
And you suddenly become of course, always
expert.
Father of something.
Even if you're wildly wrong.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. You're you're the father, quote unquote, father of X, Z, Y archaeology.
The reality is, if it's easy, you're probably doing something wrong.
Yes, that is true, and I think that's a nice message to send to people maybe wanting to apply for a PhD or a master's or something, a research degree. That if it sounds too easy, it's probably not very good.
No, and I think it's also important. I mean, a huge thing in our field, I think, is also understanding our own place in it, our own position, looking back at ourselves and saying, why are we doing this? What is the value of this? What are we, what is it about this that matters so much to us that we feel the need to do this? I mean, I know,
what is it
for me.
Oh, tell us. Don't tease me like that.
No.
It'd be like, I know for me.
I mean, quite simply, I can't imagine myself doing anything other than what I'm doing, because it is so interesting to me. It is for me as a Canadian, our fur trade heritage is such an important part of our past. And it has often been kind of smoothed over as simply, oh, well, this is, this laid the foundations for Canada, the westward expansion, all the rest of it, nice, simple, linear progression. It's not that easy. It's not that it's much more complicated. And I find it interesting because I like finding things I don't know much about. And then how can I understand, how can I fill this gap with knowledge that I, have found? And in this case, I think it's really interesting, not only because of the fur trade in and of itself, but also its connection to the broader economic changes that are going on within Europe at the time. Starting in the 17th century, when we have that establishment of the Hudson Bay Company, we see this push towards monopoly, towards these companies being set up to go out to other countries and exploit resources. We see, of course, the establishment of the East India Company. East India Company was making much more money than the Hudson Bay Company was. But at the same time, this was a huge contributor. I mean, one of my favorite ways to look at the fur trade is, if you look at any portraits of, for instance, Napoleon, where he's wearing those hats, where did that fur come from? It came from Canada. It came
from Canada.
It did. It would have been, beaver pelts that's where it came from.
Nice. Yeah.
And that's the connection. It's easily overlooked, but it did have a big impact.
Yes, true. And you know what I like about our conversation today is I like how you use those external kind of factors to do archaeology about the internal, to use them as a mirror to what was going on the inside. Because we talked about a bit about the development of archaeology, I think, and maybe because me being a Cypriot, I think there is a problem. Not necessarily a problem. It's a problem. It's a problem about colonizing archaeology and and forcing views of external people onto what the archaeology of Canada is, right?
Yeah, and also, I mean, there's a whole other conversation to be had about the idea of direct influence of one culture over another, and this secondary culture isn't really its own culture. It's just a 50-50 blend of Métis culture, just a 50-50 blend of French and Native, and that's it. And it's like, no, that's it's not how that works.
Oh my god. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap this up here. Even though I feel we can be talking about things for the next 2 to 3 hours, I won't. I will wrap the things here. So do you have any closing remarks for us? For the audience of the MARE project?
I mean, we as humans, this is why I'm interested in maritime archaeology, is because we humans, we are constantly around water in some form or another. And I think as a maritime archaeologist, though, it's often tempting to think about my own discipline as being, solely about oceans and, the seas and, your classic shipwreck, all the rest of it. But those oceans are fed by rivers, and that is where my interest lies. Where do we separate the inland from the sea? And I always like to think about going back to the Odyssey, when Odysseus is told that his journeys will end when he carries an oar inland far enough that it's mistaken for a winnowing shovel. And, that to me speaks a lot to maritime world, and my interest in it is, where is that line? Where is that point where that shovel becomes something used for agriculture instead, or that oar becomes something used for agriculture instead? That to me is interesting. Where is that boundary? Where is that liminality? What is it like to exist in both worlds? And so these are all questions I'm always interested in. And I'm also always interested in, how does our understanding of the world around us shape our interactions with water, shape the designs of the vessels we use? So it's this ongoing dialogue between the world around us and ourselves. That's essentially what it is. That's a bit rambling, but I hope that captures something.
That was amazing. Ella, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for this wonderful talk. And for the rest of you listeners, I'll see you all next time. Bye.